Hey everybody, it's Alex Miller at Capnion here. I've got what I consider a bit of a weird, bold take for you today. I think this wave of artificial intelligence that we're on right now will likely be about small business differentially for quite a while. And when big corporations really start to pick it up, it will be because they're under pressure from smaller competitors that are doing interesting new things. I think it's important to note, and I hate to be a little bit cynical here, but the larger the organization, the bigger the gap there is between we've got something in a lab somewhere and we're poking at it, and that thing has all the way made it into a core process. So I'm not saying that big corporations aren't doing anything with AI, because that's obviously not true, and you don't have to surf LinkedIn very long for it to be obvious it's not true. So why do I think this? Well, first, I'm going to talk about just the world I see right now, talking to a lot of people. And then I'm going to talk about, well, why do I think these things are true, and true in a way that there's going to be some inertia to how these things are. So, starting with right now, it's interesting to look at the extremes. The smallest organization possible that it makes sense to talk about is just one person that needs to do stuff. And I think, oddly, the most hardcore, sophisticated users of AI, in terms of really getting these things into action and implementing them in a directly useful, everyday kind of way, it's just everyday people. You can talk to all kinds of everyday people that have AI tools they really like, have developed pretty significant processes, you might say, of, well, I need to do X, Y, Z, and I lean on the following AI tool in this way, and this is why this helps me. A really interesting population I've talked about elsewhere is there's people out there that maybe without an AI tool, they're not quite up to using a scripting language like Python to automate something else they were doing. And if they can lean on ChatGPT, they're off to the races. And this extends to a lot of other things as well. People have really integrated AI tools into stuff they do to really level themselves up. And these people, you're out there, you know who you are. So one side of the story, the smallest organizations, which are just individual people doing a lot, high level of integration. On the other end of the spectrum, you can surf around on LinkedIn, which is mostly dominated by large corporate conversation. Everybody's been poking at these things very hard and vetting them and working on use cases. And you can see people in their posts are thinking of all the reasons not to do it. It's too risky. It's not ready yet. And regrettably, I, in some ways, think they're right, and that large companies have a lot of guardrails. I'll talk about that more in a second. From a large corporate standpoint, technologies like large language models are in a really uncomfortable, frightening position, I might say, of this technology is not mature enough and is almost too mature. I think everybody sees the potential, but then there's just a little bit too much risk that things do weird stuff and fly off the handle, and big corporations are not going to be ready for that until either the technology improves or they're under more pressure to take risks. So that's a good segue to, well, why do I believe this sort of situation is likely to continue? What are the durable reasons that might propel it into the future? The first one is, the bigger the organization you work for, the more time you spend waiting for permission, asking for permission, trying to figure out how to get permission, trying to figure out what you need to get permission to do and don't. And AI, let's say I set up a big LLM on a big server. That's sort of a multiverse of employees inside it. It is pretty difficult to apply standards like you would apply to employees to make sure that all the things that LLM might do, it's appropriately asking for permission and following rules. I don't mean to be bleak on this because there's a lot you could do to make this better. You could build your own LLM, for example, but building your own LLM is extremely expensive. So that's a good segue to my next point. You see me talking elsewhere about, I think AI right now, to the extent you can be kind of fast and loose, is remarkably cheap. You can do something pretty amazing pretty quickly just hitting your favorite LLM company's API, adding some prompting and maybe a little bit of extra grandpa's logic of if else, this prompt, that prompt. It's pretty amazing what you can get done pretty quickly. And then if you're in a large organization, you're going to have more and more guardrails about exactly how you do that. Does it do this weird hallucination? Where does the data go? All these kinds of questions. And it's true that the more guardrails you put, the more it rapidly gets much more complicated and expensive. And I think a good conversation piece about it getting more complicated and expensive is eventually you can probably solve just about every problem you might have by building your own LLM in your own data center on your own data. And this is really just painful reinventing the wheel. Very expensive. Just the compute time, electricity, talent is very hard to get. It's not something that every organization is going to succeed at, even if they want to put down a lot of money. And there's this whole continuum in the middle of, if you accept some risks and you don't have too many guardrails, you're open-minded, you can kind of say, like, well, what kind of value can we get? What can it do? You can do a lot for cheap, and then if it has to be exactly like this and it has to respect XYZ guardrail and regulation and stakeholder anxiety and all these things, then it rapidly becomes really, really expensive and you're trying to land on the moon. So the cost is not a universal, I think. Cost of AI depends a lot on who you are and what you want to do and how you want to do it. And then my final argument, and I made another video about this, is larger organizations tend to prioritize explicit balance sheet costs versus implicit costs like lost opportunity. So it tends to be true. A smaller organization is a lot likelier to have a reward orientation, to think about upside, be willing to accept some sketchy, poorly quantified risk. And it's kind of, like, what have you got to lose? Any large corporation is a large corporation because it's locked down a really nice gravy train. And a lot of why a larger organization is going to make you spend more time vaguely asking for permission is there's a lot to lose, and it even belongs to other people like shareholders and, publicly traded companies owned by zillions of people all over the world. So inevitably, it's much harder to compare, well, we missed this opportunity because we didn't do this because we were scared of XYZ risks. And it's always much more part of the conversation of, well, once I factored in all these rules I had to follow, all these concerns about all these different things that could go wrong, was actually very expensive on the balance sheet. The larger the organization, the less people are worried about the implicit cost of lost opportunity, the much more they tend to be worried about the explicit cost of just paying for the thing. And a boundary case that large organizations also tend to worry about is just getting sued because your AI did something stupid and nasty. But this current wave of AI, just because of its technological characteristics, what kind of risk it can generate related to what its costs are, it's likely to be all about small business.